Welcome back. It is my privilege to be speaking in this episode with Dr. Lori Baker Schena, who I love, is an educator, although maybe not in the traditional sense these days, has been an educator in higher ed. We also share some similar experiences when it comes to our background in journalism, which I think is great. But I know, Dr. Lori, you have a lot to share here. So welcome to the show. And if there's anything I missed in terms of your introduction, please let the listeners know a little bit more about who you are, where you are, and what you do.
Dan, it is so lovely to be here today, and your listeners are so lucky to have you because education and leadership are so important, yet they're not topics that are often talked about together. So it's just a unique, opportunity for your listeners and for yourself. So I'm Dr. Lori Baker Schena. I am today a leadership coach and a professional speaker, but my roots are in education. I spent 25 years as a university professor teaching journalism and public relations. I also did a little bit on a newspaper for 2 years after college before realizing that it just wasn't for me, which was heartbreaking because I was the top of my class in journalism. So it's one thing I always taught my students is even if you start something, you might not, in college, it might not be your thing going forward. And then I got my doctorate in organizational leadership from the University of Laverne. And interestingly enough, Dan, that program was geared to principals and people in education. So I got a lot of information. I made a lot of friends in teaching, teachers and administrators in the K through 12 environment. So I have this broad background from K to, postdoctorate. And so that was really, really important to me in terms of expanding who I was and my leadership skills. And what happened to me was about 7 years ago, I got diagnosed with cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And it really was a wake up call to me. I was a tenured professor, so I was ready to just stay there for the rest of my life. But I realized there was a bigger world out there, and I really enjoyed my leadership training and coaching. So I said goodbye to the tenured position, retired, and now have a very successful business coaching leaders, coaching all sorts of people who need leadership coaching, and also speaking across the country about leadership topics. So that is why your podcast just was so exciting to be a part of because it's just right up my alley.
That's awesome, and I think you're right up my alley as well, especially when you talk about how, combining leadership and education sometimes, doesn't necessarily happen. You mentioned, of course, the background in journalism that I said we share in common, and I agree with you because I also went through a doctoral program, to get my EDD that was really general leadership, like literally the degree, and I have it sitting in front of me, is a Doctor of Education in Leadership, and it didn't really specify school administration or not. And because it was an education doctorate, it was geared more toward the education setting, but like you, more organizational leadership in general. And I love the program for that. And so again, I think something that we have in common. Um, let's get back to though what you said about bringing together leadership and education. Your experience is mostly in higher ed. Mine is more in K to 12. But I think in general, I agree with you that sometimes, when it comes to those two things, it's hard sometimes for people to bring them together. Why is it so hard, and how can they really start to think of those two things as coming together more?
Dan, that is such a great question. And I think the reason we don't do it is because we don't think about it. Educators are educators. They're there to educate students and help them succeed. But there comes a point where who are you as an educator? And I think the idea that I see is that all educators are leaders. Because if you look at the characteristics of a leader, motivators, role models, encouragers, organizers, educators are natural leaders, but we haven't really had a formalized dialogue across the country about helping our educators become better leaders. And I have to tell you, leadership is learned. I mean, some people are quote unquote natural leaders, but we have to teach leadership. And in my world, I have noticed that outside of education, you've been to jobs where people are promoted because they do a good job. But just because they do a good job at what they do doesn't mean that they're going to be a good manager or supervisor. So you end up with this person who's absolutely miserable as a leader. You've got miserable employees. Everyone's miserable because no one taught that person how to work in a team, how to do conflict management, how to communicate. So all these things are never taught. So this is what my goal is from I call this my legacy position, is to help give those training skills to leaders. So the same thing with educators. You are doing all these things, but you've never really been taught how to manage teams. And teamwork's huge in education, especially, with your peers, and how to manage conflict. And conflict is part of our lives. So bringing that information into the environment is so important. And that is why this whole thing just really is a passionate talk that I give, and it's a passion of mine.
So I know that as part of all of that, in terms of, realizing, and by the way, if you've not listened to my show before, and it's okay if you haven't, you might not know, at the end of every episode, I literally say, no matter who you are or where you are, you too can be a leader of learning. And because I believe so strongly in what you just said, that no matter what your role is in education, you are a leader. If you're a classroom teacher, you're a leader. If you're an instructional coach like I am, a school administrator, a district administrator, you're a leader regardless. And I really have basically built this platform off of that notion that it's really for labelless leadership. It doesn't matter what label is on you or what title you have, you're a leader. Having said that,
I love that, by the way, label-less leadership.
yeah,
Absolutely. That's why your
yeah.
podcast is so valuable, Dan. I'm just saying it's so valuable because you're filling this humongous void.
I
Really.
appreciate that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so go ahead.
No, having said that, I know that part of the leadership in education piece that you like to speak about is also the idea of leadership branding. And in my experience and in my opinion, sometimes the word branding is not only confusing, especially for educators, but sometimes becomes like a taboo subject where educators don't really want to touch it because I don't know why. It's a very business-like term. It may, kind of exude this idea of money and monetization, but I don't believe so. I think that branding is a very big part and should be a very big part of education, both personal branding and also branding schools and districts. So I was just wondering if we could kinda start there for a minute. And I think really back up all the way to the point at which I would love to hear your explanation of what a brand is, first of all, and how can we bring it into schools and into education?
Thank you. I love speaking on this topic, Dan, because again, there's so many misconceptions about branding, especially in these days, social media branding, brand managers and all this. But it's so crucial as someone out in the community, as an educator, as a leader, to know how you are showing up. And that is the bottom line. So, a brand, we all know, we all have our favorite brands. Dan, give me a brand that you love. What's one of your favorite brands that you don't do anything? I always told my students, what do you love that you wouldn't not use any other type competitor, that what you love? What's your favorite brand?
That's a good question. Well, because I'm an audio guy with podcasting, I've started to really enjoy products that are made by Anchor's Soundcore brand for my headphones and my wireless earbuds. So Anchor Soundcore is a good brand for me.
And how does that brand show up for you? What resonates with you? What Give me three characteristics that you say this is why I want an Anchors.
Yeah, I think that first of all, their quality is exceptional. The price is low, and they just really, I think, care about what they do a lot. They put a lot of time and effort into like the customer experience.
So you've got quality, you've got pricing, and you've got customer service. All right. These are three key traits of this brand, and it'll have you come back for more, but you identify with that. Well, people have brands too. And when you look at who's one of your leaders who you look up to, I'm sure that you could figure out three characteristics that they show up with. And this is so important for your listeners. It's no accident the way people show up. If they're good, if they understand all this, they're mindfully exhibit the traits that their brand is. So I'm going to ask you again, who's one of your favorite leaders, just in any public leader? Who do you
Ooh,
admire?
that's a good question. Because I'm a sports fan and I love
Mhm.
the New York Mets, I think David Wright, who was the captain of the Mets for a long time, is a strong leader in my book.
Okay, and what are the 3 characteristics that you see of him that make really personify him, that characterize him?
I think when he was playing, he led by example on the field. He tried to do the right thing at all times. He was super supportive of his teammates, and I think just in general, unlike some professional athletes, I saw him as someone who really tried to carry himself in a very respectful and and appropriate kind of a way in the public eye.
So that is his brand, and that is what you expected to see every time you saw him. And that's why you admired him, that's why you became a fan. So, interestingly enough, all of us carry brands. And what I want to say, I always say this, it's not your what you've done in the past is a reputation, all right? Your brand is who you are today and what you want to show up like tomorrow. So, when you walk into a classroom or you walk into a meeting, what do people expect to see? Do they see professionalism? Do they see knowledge? Do they see compassion? Who are you as a leader? So the first thing that you need to do is really do a deep dive into yourself and look at the traits that A, you either have, or B, you would like to have. It's always an authentic thing. And then you really want to identify them and then learn how to communicate them so that they become part of you. So when you walk into a room, they go, "Oh, there's Joe. We know that Joe is blah, blah, blah. We can count on Joe. Joe is uplifting. Joe is this and that." So we might not do that consciously, but now we need to do that consciously because everyone has a personal brand and it does make a difference, especially in these day and age when you need to differentiate yourself and you need to really emphasize your leadership. So those are the couple of things that we need to think about.
Let me just ask you a follow-up question before we talk
Yes.
about doing kind of branding more in education. You mentioned, and I was going to ask you this because I've heard personal branding before described as more like a reputation, but you have sort of a clear distinction where reputation is more like what you've done in the past, and your brand is sort of where you're living in the present. And so I guess my follow-up question is, does a brand sort of stick with you? Is it fluid? Can you turn around a brand when maybe things aren't going as well as you want them to, or people aren't really resonating with someone based on what they bring to the table with their brand?
Absolutely. Such a great question, Dan. Yes, you can change your brand. You can create one and also change one, but you have to really understand that it's very difficult for people to change in general. So you have to do some real deep dive core thinking about who you are, and that becomes your authentic self. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're not that confident working in teams. Like you're really confident in the classroom, but when you're amongst your peers in these team meetings, you're not confident in your, let's say, your administrative ability. So you really need to work on that confidence, and whether it means more training, whether it means better self-talk, that you are a good enough, all those things that you need to build that confidence so that when you so that what that becomes a part of you, and once that becomes a part of you, then you show up at these meetings confident and people know that they can depend on you for this and this and this because you've spoken up, you've shown your confidence. So it's really it's really all about your um, a self journey where you look at yourself, look at your leadership skills, and figure out how you can strengthen and possibly change that so that you can get ahead or meet those goals. So that is a great question. And yes, you can change.
I appreciate that.
It
And
has to be authentic. It can't be
again,
like, you cannot fake a brand. You have to really live
Yeah.
it.
I love what you said too about how difficult it is for people to change. And I apologize in advance if any of my listeners are tired of me telling this story. But I wrote a dissertation all about leadership to help inspire a growth mindset in teachers, and basically how to push through resistance to help people change better. And so I love talking about that sort of stuff, and in terms of that branding, and in terms of helping people understand and kind of move forward with this idea of personal branding, again, regardless of the labels or the titles, if you're in education, you're a leader, and therefore you kind of bring about a brand with you, regardless of whether or not you kind of intending to. You made it sound kind of simple, and I'm sure it's not, and I'm hoping that you have a system for doing so. But you talked about like the top few, let's say three qualities. I named the Anchor Soundcore brand. I named David Wright as some brands that I admire. Is it that simple for educators to think of what are the top few skills that I bring to the table, or how can they establish and recognize and be mindful of what they bring to the table in terms of their own brand?
That's a great question. And actually, there's a lot of practical things you can do to get to this place. That's one of the things I differentiate myself as a motivational speaker, because I always talk about bringing joy into your life, and that's really important for me. But there's always practical stuff you can do. Um, so I do want to say that the first thing you have to understand is, what value do you bring to the table? And that's one of the questions. What value do I bring? I think that'll help you to identify these things. And so what I suggest you do is keep a strengths journal for a month. And let me tell you what a strengths journal is. Every day, at the end of the day, you're going to go home and you're going to write down 5 things that went right, 5 things that you did. And this is the ticket. What characteristics did you bring, or what skills did you bring to make that happen? So when you start analyzing all of the good things that you're doing, and all whether it's in the classroom, whether it's personally, even in your family life, but what are you bringing to the table? And if you do this like 5 days a week, take the weekends off if you want, but 5 days, you've got 100 different strengths that you have, and you all of a sudden you start seeing your strengths, and that is something that you can build on when you're talking about your personal brand, because those are your authentic strengths. And it also helps build your confidence. I don't think we're nice enough to ourselves. I think our self-talk needs to be much more positive. And this is one really practical way to do that. So the second step is to ask people around you. And I know this is really annoying, but you have to do it. It's called a 360-degree, analysis. What do I do well? Because it's so amazing how you don't even know what you do well, or you don't even know how you show up, because a lot of us just aren't that conscious of how we show up in the world. And you would be surprised the gems that people say about you that you had no idea. And if you're really brave, you ask them what you're screwing up on, and ask people that you trust, like people who are just haters, to get rid of them. You don't want anything to do with them. But if you do that, you have a really good idea of where your strengths are from what people see, the perception of you. So when you can marry what you think of you to your perception of you, you can start really getting an idea of what kind of person you are and what kind of leader you are. And from there, I would suggest some really good leadership books to really discover, because there's all sorts of different leadership styles. So this kind of self-growth and who you are, so that when you do show up, you demonstrate those, you communicate and demonstrate those strengths. And it's a beautiful thing, and it's very powerful, because we want, as educators, we need to be empowered, and we also need to be role models for our students and for our peers. And when a student sees an educator who's really confident in themselves and really shows up as maybe compassionate or skilled, that elevates the whole experience, which is why this is so very important for educators.
I love so much of what you said, and that journaling process is gold. I think I'm gonna start doing that. I'm not a big journaler, but I really appreciate that idea. I also love about that process that you really talked about focusing on strengths. And as much as I am into growth mindset and understanding that, failure and learning from your mistakes is a big part of that, I do think that focusing on strengths will help people, whether you're a class, quote unquote, just a classroom teacher or a school leader or a content creator like I am. Understanding what you do well and what you bring to the table is important, but also I just wanted to point out, because you also said, if you get brave, you can sort of ask people maybe where you need to improve or what kind of things you might not do as well. I think understanding more about yourself and your strengths and your quote unquote brand will help you filter through the negativity much more. And because, as you probably know as well, educators, we wear our hearts on our sleeves. We invest so much of ourselves into what we do. We take things so personally that sometimes you hear a little bit of criticism and you jump, you go to extremes. And really, you could do a thousand things well, one thing wrong, and you're like, oh man, I'm not doing it. I can't. And that's not how it is. I mean, even as a podcaster, I've gotten a lot of compliments over the few years that I've been doing this. And, you talk about branding. I know that there are things that I do well and the reasons why people enjoy this show, but I have heard some criticism as well. And understanding those few things that are strengths of mine and strengths of this show help me to not only filter out the criticisms, but also to realize which one of them I really want to focus on, or which ones are the real important or serious ones.
Absolutely. I do a lot of work, I do so many different topics, but one of them is really having that core confidence that you can be internally motivated. So whatever is thrown at you, and when we're out there as a podcaster or out there in public, or in the classroom, you're really vulnerable because people criticize now more than ever. I mean, it's just a very toxic environment. So it's crucial to figure out, I always say, figure out the source. Who is actually speaking, and is it worth paying attention to? Because a lot of people are hurting and a lot of people are angry and they don't know where to put that, so they'll lash out at you. So when I say consider the source, some people show up to work and they've had a horrible night. They've had a horrible night with their spouse or their kids, or they're not feeling well, and with this COVID thing, that lay over the tragedy and the illness. So you have to really consider the source and not take anything personally, except the things that are going to be beneficial. Like, I've done several podcasts. I like being a guest. I don't necessarily need to do my own, but as a guest, and the topics are your favorite failure. What's your favorite failure? And I'm a big one on failing and learning, but it's crucial that you don't let the haters, as I say, really mess with your head, because when you're on a path, you have to really listen deep to you. So I love that so much. And look, you're courageous to have this podcast, Dan. I mean, you put yourself out there every week, and the people who are criticizing, they don't have a podcast. I mean, that's the first thing I would say to you. It's easy enough to, complain, or, when you look at a football game or something and you complain about the kicker, you're not out there kicking. I just like, we just are so used to putting our 2 cents in. And so we have to understand that and carry ourselves with that confidence that it's good to learn things, but not to let others, take away from who we are. That's just a crucial thing. And we do that. And I think it's something we have to be mindful of all the time.
Yeah, I agree. And just one more thing on the strengths based approach. This is actually the second episode in a row where we've talked about some of this stuff. My last guest, John Davis, we talked about, essentially just giving a lot of positive praise and feedback to others when you're in leadership positions. But I think in some ways, not to sound too cheesy or cliche, like it starts with us though too. We
Absolutely.
need to understand what we're doing well, what we're good at, what we bring to the table. Again, like what is it that we stand for in terms of our brands? When we're in a classroom with students every day, when we're in our schools every day, our districts, what are we coming into each day and into each situation with in terms of how we're presenting ourselves and how we deal with and work with others?
Absolutely. And my whole thing, and that's it's on my website too, is to pivot to the positive. Whenever you're in doubt, stay positive, no matter what, especially when people are counting on you, because you never move forward, being negative. And so that's really really crucial too. Another book I want to I'd like to recommend a book which was my Bible in school, for me in my doctorate program. It's called The Leadership Challenge. Have you heard of it, Dan? With Barry
It sounds
Posner and
familiar.
James Cuso. And there's five different
Yeah.
characteristics of a leader, and it's so uplifting and so easy to understand it, and it really gets you in that frame of mind of what a leader is and what it can bring to the table. Again, it's the leadership challenge, and it's an older book, but one of my favorite, the five characters, is modeling the way. So we really, as educators, I think it's our responsibility to model leadership. So if we understand our leadership and we move forward with it, you are going to be impacting so many lives because they're going to see what a real leader looks like and they can emulate that. And that I think is the ultimate thing you can do as a leader. And something that I really prided myself on in my classroom is to stay positive, to be a hard worker, to get your thing, you get your assignments in on time. I was a really hard professor. And that leadership has these kids now are 20 years out and they're doing so well. A lot of them is because of those leadership traits they learned in my classroom. And it's never too young to learn these traits. Kindergartners, second, if I had learned leadership traits when I was in fifth grade, I would be totally more ahead of the game than I am today, right? So I think this is something you want to even think about in your curriculum, no matter what you teach, is leadership. I think it's a crucial thing. It's an interesting thing, and it's just important for us to really focus on.
I hadn't really thought about that before. I think that's an excellent point. So for those of you listening who have any sort of impact or can make an impact on um, curricular choices, it might not be a bad idea to start working with those upper elementary, middle school, high school students on their own personal brands, and if nothing else, like we said already, those strengths that they feel like they have that they bring to the table in any situation that they're in. I think that's an awesome point. As we do start to wrap up here, I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't ask you about one of the other aspects of your professional life at this point, which is the leadership consortium. I think, I hope that one of the things that I don't know whether how you want to look at it. Maybe it's unfortunate or fortunate. Is that we've been realizing more and more and tackling more and more the issue of equity. I know certainly in education we have, whether it comes to gender equality or sexual equality or racial equality. My hope is that we're finally really listening. I know we're still having issues with it as we record here. There was just a tragedy within the past few days in the Asian community. But I think what you're doing to empower women in leadership is really important. And I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, thank you, Dan. That's one of my heart companies and one of my heart projects. I noticed when I was teaching, I taught a lot of seniors in the university setting. I would ask the guys, are you afraid? Are you feel confident enough to negotiate a salary going into a job interview? And the guys were all, sure, we'll ask for what we want, and they had no problems with it. They weren't intimidated or asking for a raise as the kids got into jobs. And the women were scared out of their minds to ask for what they wanted. And it occurred to me that women have not been taught how to negotiate. And on top of that, you've got a confidence, which is a whole nother topic, Dan, but a confidence issue with women. For some reason, women when they're little, up to like 4 or 5, they're very confident. They run around, they learn how to walk and talk. But then when they get into school, a lot of things happen, peer pressure, and as older, social media, that really hurts their self-confidence, and then that ripples in everything they do. So I started Leadership Consortium because I know that women have a place at the table now. We're getting better, but we're not staying at the table because nobody's teaching them leadership skills, how to navigate the workforce, how to work in a team, how to manage conflict, how to be more confident, how to delegate. All these things that are so important, women just aren't learning. And I teach men too, but women have that confidence layer that needs to be addressed too. And that, unfortunately, it's a reality. And there are some women who are confident, but most women, their negative talk is surprisingly widespread. So we work on the real, with my doctorate, we have a, intense leadership training, but also work on those confidence skills that you can show up and be confident without being aggressive or, all that stereotype of the whole bitch thing. But you can walk in, be confident, get things done, be your own brand, but really feel like you're making a difference. And that's what that company is about. So I have two companies, one for everybody and one when I work with women organizations, women in corporations. And so we have long way to go, but I think it makes me feel good to give women those skills, those leadership skills. To say thank you for letting me talk about it, because it's a passion project of mine, which actually got started as a university professor.
No, I think it's great. I really appreciate you mentioning it because, we know that in education, it is a female dominated profession, yet proportionally speaking, few women are assuming the quote unquote typical or traditional leadership roles in schools and districts. And it's even worse for minorities. And so, any chance that I can highlight those types of issues. Look, again, I'm sort of dating this episode and the recording a little bit because we're recording probably a little over a month out. But just within the last 24 to 48 hours, we saw a clear example in the sports world. Lori, I don't know if you saw it, but a women's college basketball athlete just posted an image comparing the men's weight room and locker room at the NCAA tournament, which is like the mecca of college basketball, to the women's weight room. And the men's facility was much more elaborate and had a lot more equipment and was just more impressive. Whereas the women's locker room had like one rack of free dumbbell weights, and pretty much that was it. And I think it's the same sometimes in education and in corporations where you clearly just have so many more opportunities and advantages for white men, and not minorities and not women, and it's just a fact. And I try and keep it real here on the podcast as well in terms of who I'm representing as my guests. I keep a spreadsheet of every guest episode that I put out, and which ones feature women and which ones feature minorities and other individuals from underrepresented communities, and it's important for me to spread the wealth. So that's, again, I'm getting off my soapbox now, but I thank you for sharing that, and I thank you for your work in that area.
And I appreciate your understanding and mindfulness of that. I was horrified with that story, and then horrified, not surprised. But we need to do something. We need to do something, and I think taking action and it starts with us. It starts with us, and saying to ourselves, we're not going to, we're going to try to not. We're not going to take that. We're going to elevate ourselves and start moving in the right direction. I think that's a really good commitment we can all make.
I agree, and I'm gonna end it right there because I think that's a great way to kind of take us out and lead us out of here. But before we do, please just remind everyone about your website and your social media, anywhere that they can find and follow you, because you definitely have some awesome stuff to share and some great content. So, how can they find you?
The best way to find me, thanks, Dan, is loribakershena.com. You can email me from there. I'm very old school and I like emails. I like to talk to you and reach out and ask any question you like. I'd love to speak with you. This is a passion project of mine. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Dr. Lori, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being an amazing guest and sharing an amazing message here on the show. I appreciate getting to meet you and just for the opportunity to really speak with you today. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan.